Welcome, everyone. This is what we call Hall of Fame season, where the Baseball Hall of Fame, the Football Hall of Fame, and the Basketball Hall of Fame all have a lot to say, including in my Halls of Fame that I've created, which is something I'll promote another time. But we're going to be focusing on one of those big three, the Football Hall of Fame, with the man who I consider to be my favorite Pro Football Hall of Fame expert, Paul Lawrence. How you doing?
Good, Kurt. How are you doing as we approach the end of one year and the beginning of another?
Yeah, and we did something recently where I asked you for your take on the Pro Football Hall of Fame semifinalists. And here we are now with the finalists, which I think if we were to have predicted which 15 would have gone through, this is probably the 15, whether we wanted it or not.
Yeah, I don't. We'll get into this a little more detail, but I don't think there's any huge surprises. There were
No.
perhaps a couple, but I don't think none that are going to ultimately impact the process as it plays out and as the voters consider these and as they whittle it down to whatever final number they decide to elect this year. But the people we thought would be returning are here, and we'll go over that. And
Hmm.
of course, we've got a bunch of first ballot guys, which I don't, none of those really surprise us. But there's going to be some heated debate on a few of those, which we've
Yes.
already prefaced. So
Yes.
yeah, we're at a good starting point with the 15. It's a rough process to go from 160 to 50 to 25 to 15, but we're here for the modern candidates.
Hmm. Well, let's just get right to the man who I think is going to be the most heated debate of them all. We're going to go through this five position. And before I ask your take on it, I'm just going to preface something that is important to me, may not be important to everyone in our group. And what I mean by that, for anyone who's just watching this for the first time, Paul and I, we have a little X group of Pro Hall of Fame, Football Hall of Fame enthusiasts who, whenever there's something sort of new or something they want to discuss, we sort of like go into our private group for that. Some of them are not necessarily big on the idea of first ballot inductees, or they don't necessarily put a premium on that. I should word that better. Uh, I'm in the opposite camp. I think if you're given that first ballot inductee, that means you are the creme de la creme. You are, then that does mean something. I don't know that I necessarily want a separate wing. You've got sort of like all like behind you, you've got that whole wing of everybody. But if they did that, it wouldn't bother me per se. Saying that, we have somebody who at quarterback, the only quarterback who made it to the semis, who's made it here, who has a really good shot at that, and he is nowhere near, to, in my opinion, a first ballot Hall of Fame inductee. We're talking about Eli Manning. Obviously, he's going to be inducted at some point. You don't go in your first year of eligibility as a finalist and not get in at some point. Paul, does he belong here in year one? What do you
Well, you kind of touched upon, some of the different views and opinions on Eli Manning, and you're right. I mean, there are folks who, and even voters, over the years, even since, I can remember when he retired, that this is not very common. I mean, we would start to see public comments by voters when they were
think?
asked when he retired about his chances. And it would be rare for most voters to come out with a strong negative view, especially on a player such a high profile and a two-time Super Bowl MVP in Eli Manning. But we were hearing grumbling then publicly from some voters, and now here we are 5 years later, approximately, and there again have been through this process in the last few months, voters who are animate that he's not a first ballot, and some are questioning his Hall of Fame resume to begin with, which leads me to believe that there's obviously enough energy and enough interest by the voters to get him this far. It is what it is. And so he's going to go in the room. He's going to be presented like each of these other 15, and they're going to discuss the cases, and then they'll go through the vote down. We'll talk more about the process later. And there's going to be some heated. I mean, I've heard voters say this is going to be a very intense, heated debate. I mean, they can, in the past, they've discussed a single candidate for half an hour, an hour. Eli's going to be over an hour. And I'm sure there's going to be some strong, passionate voices in that room among the 50 voters. And I think it's really split. And our group represents that. The group you refer to, our smaller group that we talk about all things, there's a lot of differences among that group. The way I look at it is, and I kind of lamented when we got closer to the class of 2025, because I knew this was going to be the topic on everybody's mind. And I
Hmm.
think it takes away from the process a little bit and the others that are deserved to be considered, and ultimately those who will be elected. It's not all just about Eli, but it's becoming that way. Very polarizing individual because he was never an all-pro, right? He has a few Pro Bowls. He never really led the league in any statistics. Yes, he played long enough in an era to make top 10 in some of the key passing stats, but so did several others of his peers because of the way the game is played today. But I don't think if you look at regular seasons and a career, you don't see him as a top five in any of those seasons. And even again in his career, if you compare him just against his peers, he wouldn't be in the top five. But yet he's got the two Super Bowls with the MVP, which is what his case really is based on. So I think it's going to be interesting. We won't know a lot. The discussions are not made public. The vote counts are not made public. We're hear some rumbling, going in and coming out of the meeting by some folks, but you're not going to really know much. I would be quite surprised if he advances further. And the only thing I can think about is a point I made earlier. It's just how uncommon it is for voters to publicly really be taking strong negative stands on a candidate. That's not something they may be lukewarm or kind of neutral. That's fine, but there have been a number of them and there's 50 voters. He's going to need 80% to get through the various stages to election. That means it only takes 11 people not to put him on their ballot when they come to move down from the 15 to the 10 to the 7 and then their final ballots of up to 5, which that whole public kind of debate makes me think those are the vocal ones. There's bound to be a bunch of silent ones, but he's here. He's going to be discussed and he
Hmm.
isn't going away, which means in the coming years, even though we're going to see guys like Drew Brees, your buddy, a
Hi,
year from
buddy.
now, and
Yep.
then Ben Roethlisberger, and of course Tom Brady.
Hmm.
There are more quarterbacks. He may sit and wait a while, but he is not going to go away. I just don't think he's going to get elected.
Yeah, and for those who just, if you're sort of like new, like a new watcher, you're just new to anything that I'm doing in general, uh, I think you can sort of like look at the pro and the con just on X. Look at pro Gary Myers, who's one of the voters. Gary is very pro Eli Manning. Uh, and kudos to Gary, kudos to you, man, because you don't have to be as vocal as you are, and I think that you are doing that. I don't necessarily agree with you on this, but I respect everything that you're saying so much that I think I've got to go back and well, actually I am going to go back. I'm going to be watching because thankfully you can do that and watch because he's hinging most of this on the two playoff series, not just the Super Bowls, but just everything going through that. And I'm going to do that before you and I do that because Paul and I also do a series where we're looking at classic games. And as we're recording this in the penultimate, I love that word, penultimate day of 2024. In 2025, we've reached 1987 in our series. So maybe we can get Gary on one of those. That'd be great. But Gary's the pro, and then our good friend is the con, Jack Silverstein, who does a phenomenal job on his on Twitter. Read Jack, check that out if you haven't already. And it's not that Jack is anti Eli; he's anti Eli right away,
Yeah,
which I think
yeah. So
is if I'm
he's
in.
right, and him and some other folks are taking a different perspective on it. I think one that maybe more voters need to consider, but I don't think they really do, which is they're looking at the bigger picture, broader view of things and saying, we have semifinalists, we have some finalists we're going to name here, whose
Mhm.
time is running out very quickly on that modern ballot, and they only get so many. They get the 20 years eligibility. And Jack and some others make a valid point in that do we need to discuss Eli in year one because he's going to take a slot in this process as a finalist and maybe in a final 10, maybe even if he makes the final seven, away from others whose time is running out and deserve to have their case considered. He's not necessarily saying, like you just indicated, that Eli isn't deserving of the Hall of Fame. He's saying other players are, but
Hmm.
they never get a chance to be fully considered, have a few years on that finalist ballot, and be able to get elected before they fall into the abyss, which is the senior pool, which is
Hmm.
very difficult to get out of because of the number of slots per year is even smaller than the modern. And so he makes a good point, and him and some others think a lot about eligibility and how that's important. Frank Cooney, who's also been writing a lot about the Hall process, he's a voter, points that out in his recent column this weekend about where these 15, and he actually lists them all in terms of eligibility remaining. And he says you've got five, one third of the finalists are first ballot players. Again, nobody's saying these guys aren't deserving; they're all going to get in, but there's a recency there. These are players who played for the most part in the 2000s, and there are other guys who played a bit earlier who aren't getting this far, but aren't going to remain on the ballot and can't even if they don't get the final 15, they don't get presented, they don't get discussed in any earlier round, they're forgotten. So it's a fair debate to have about how to effectively use the 15 slots. My sense of it over the years and looking at this, you've got 50 voters. They look at that semifinalist ballot. They're just picking who they think the top 15 are in their mind most deserving. And they're not giving often much thought to this issue of eligibility and why rush five or one third of the finalists that are first ballot. And there were guys who didn't make this or guys who were on this list who won't go further in this process whose time is running out.
Hmm. One thing I've sort of learned running my mock hall, uh, and what I'm referring to there, for those not aware, it's a Pro Football Hall of Fame Revisited project, where Paul's one of the voters, obviously so am I, and we've got about anywhere, depending on who decides to vote that year I put in air quotes, between 30 and one time it was 40, uh, where we acted as if the Pro Football Hall of Fame began in 1946. One thing that I have right now, we're in 1971. Pretty much, if you're not getting in the first year or the first 5 years, you're not getting it at all. But then we've cleared the path of so many
Yeah.
people. So it's a sort of a different thing where I really created this just to see if there would be any kind of weird backlog. So far as it's going, no, there's not. And whoever might be watching this who did not vote for Jim Brown in the semifinalist of this year, I don't know what you were thinking, but I could go back and check it out. I might kick you off. I haven't decided yet, or maybe you're doing that just to see if I actually notice that.
Could be
Could
somebody
be.
who's just trying to test you.
Yeah, it could be just to keep me on my toes. But anywho, so yeah, Eli is certainly very polarizing. I think to your point, Paul, with the people who are coming up, with Drew, Ben, Tom coming, if he doesn't get in right away, uh, it's not that he's not going to get in at some point, but you, I don't think that anyone here can tell me that he's above any of those other three. Maybe you could make that case for Ben Roethlisberger, especially in terms of, and some people will say this, the character issue. I don't want to go into that more here. We have some other people that we might discuss that later, but it's going to be fascinating. If he gets in right away, so be it. I'm not going to throw a hissy fit over it, but I, I is Eli Manning in my mind one of the top five people who are finalists? No,
Yeah.
I got him number 11 for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think that's probably, and given this is the 15 we have to deal with, it may not have been
Yeah.
exactly the 15 that we or our group would have picked.
Right.
But I think if you're putting him in around 11th out of this group of 15, I think that's a fair slot for him. Again, we really we don't know. We will know because they do actually announce the cut downs from 15 to 10 to 7, and then eventually we'll find out who's elected. So we'll get a sense of how far he went in this process, and that will give us a bit of an indication, what his support was like and how long that support held him in contention, so to speak, and
Right.
that might be a bit interesting to see how far he actually gets in the process.
Well, I'm going to go next here to the person who I have last of my personal 15, and this person doesn't dislike me, unlike another running back who dislikes you. An inside joke between Paul and I. I've mentioned that in the last one. I'm not going to go do that here. Uh, Although I will say that that individual is completely wrong, and if this individual dislikes me for this take, he would be right because at least I said it.
Yeah.
Fred Taylor, I would have been happy if he was my running back for 10 years as a Saints fan. I'm just putting that out there. Is Fred Taylor a Pro Football Hall of Famer? I don't believe so. Is Fred Taylor the best running back available? I definitely do not believe so. He's here. He's the only running back who advanced. Who's the other? Ricky Waters. I got Ricky ahead of him personally.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, Fred Taylor for me is in that weird group of really, really good running backs who could have been pushed here. Corey Dillon, one.
Yeah.
Who's another one? That's Eddie George. Could have very well been here.
Steven Jackson, Sean Alexander, you
Well,
know,
we talked about earlier first ballot people. I got
right.
Marshawn Lynch ahead of all of them.
Yeah. There's another guy that just,
Didn't make a semis.
yeah.
Did he? Yeah. So either way, he's here. This is the second year in a row. I've made my point. This is about you. So please go
No.
ahead.
No. So yeah, I mean, you hit upon it, and our viewers might be interested. We have done a previous show, right, with a group of us actually looked at that era of running backs, kind of the late 90s into the 2000s, right? And we had a lengthy breakdown and discussion of all of those, and we ranked them. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kurt, but I think Ricky Waters was he at the top of that process for
Uh,
us or near the top?
Near the top. That one, I think I was so busy I couldn't participate, but I did read it after.
And I mean, Fred Taylor was much further down. Again,
Yeah.
in comparison to his peers, we were having that discussion. And that's one of the challenges, I think, with Frank Taylor's case, in my view, is
Mhm.
he played at a time when there were a bunch of other running backs, and those are all, in my view, kind of grouped together because each one of them has a resume with some highlights to it. You've got some guys in there that have a 2,000 yard season. You have guys in there that have led the league in rushing. You have guys there that were first team All Pro. In case of Fred Taylor, he was first team All Pro once in his career. He put together a lot of good seasons. He had some good runs. He had a couple good playoff runs. There's a case there. I just don't think, and I agree with you, that it elevates him above other running backs that could have been considered. And we've already mentioned two of them that we feel pretty strongly about, and that in Ricky Waters
Mhm.
and Marshawn Lynch. Marshawn Lynch will have more time. Yeah, I think he will move through the process eventually. He's just been on the ballot, like I said, recently. Ricky Waters' time is running out of it this year or next. So he's in a dilemma. And I just don't think when you're getting down to this level of 15, and I don't know if your mindset is we need to have a running back, which is kind of a weird mindset to have to begin with. I don't think you need to have one in the 15. Fred Taylor's made it last year to this far. He obviously has his supporters. I just don't think among his peers and his running backs and his comparative to the running backs in the hall already in the so-called modern era, I don't think he matches up very well. And yeah, I would put him at the bottom of these 15 myself.
I'm going to throw this out at you too. One thing that we've seen in the 2024 season that I I would not have predicted. Uh, we're recording this before week 18 of the NFL season, and there is, I guess, a 50-50 shot that Saquon Barkley is going to break Eric Dickerson's record. Uh, Derrick Henry could, well, I don't think he will, but Derrick Henry had an astounding year with Baltimore. Yet, and he had a year in Baltimore where Lamar Jackson still broke the quarterback rushing record.
Yeah.
The running game is back. you know,
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think you know where I'm going with this here
yeah, yeah,
because we were watching pretty much up until this season. I think I should have had this. I just thought of this now, where like every year it's more passing, 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 and we've got two stud running backs, not rookies either.
yeah,
You know, who I think it would have been fair to say that going into 2024, if you were to say to both you and I, oh, you know who's going to be the two best running backs, Barkley and Henry. Like, really? I thought their best days might have been behind them, especially
yeah.
when they're with a new team. Well, the more that they're doing, the less special someone like Fred Taylor is. And again, I'm not against Fred Taylor per se. I would have been thrilled. I think you would have been thrilled with him as a Cowboys fan. That's my guy for 10 years. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm cool. But was Fred Taylor, and the same question I have with Eli Manning, was Fred Taylor ever the top three running back? Eh, in any
Well, he
year,
was, I
going
mean,
at it?
the stats and the All-Pro selections answer that question, and
Yeah.
with the exception of perhaps 1 year, he never led the league in rushing. So, yeah, what was he ever that guy when you'd say, "Hey, I want him on my team"? When you had choices of say three other running backs in any given season when he was playing, he would not have been that guy. I mean, again, for Jaguar fans and teammates, he was a good fit. He had a great career. But is that great enough to make him come out of that year group of running backs in that early 2000s era
Mhm.
and get himself a slot in the 15?
Well, apparently
And he's
so.
taking and he's taking the place of somebody who probably deserves it. And we're going to talk about him later.
Yeah. Well, so we're going to go to the wide receivers. We've got, you talk about, it feels like ever since I've been paying attention to this, which might be about 15 years, and well, you've been paying attention a lot longer than I have. Wide receivers is just a log jam after log jam, and we've got two big studs coming back. Both of them have something in common. They're both on their sixth year of consecutive as a 6 year returnee. Torrey Holt and Reggie Wayne, joined by Steve Smith, who seems like the outlier. What do you think? Nothing
Yeah, I
against
think
Smith, but
I think of the 15 on here, the person who sort of surprised me to some degree was seeing Steve Smith advance. And he has a strong case. I
mhm,
understand it, but it kind of goes back to the point you made just a minute ago. We have a lot of receivers on these ballots year after year. It creates a lot of these log jams because voters can't rank them and figure out who to advance. We've made some headway with Andrew Johnson being elected, for example, but we've got these two guys you mentioned in Wayne and Holt who have been here several years now. Both had advanced to the round of final 10. Holt has done that the last 2 years, and usually at that level, they're sort of like on the on deck circle, right? They're getting
yeah,
close. And so you got to think that Holt's in a good position this year, Wayne, but then you're introducing a whole another X factor by adding another receiver into a mix when voters are still trying to sort out between Holt and Wayne. I don't think it really helps the process very well. I
right,
hope it does not cost Holt, who, as I mentioned, has been well positioned and obviously has the support of voters to be in the final 10 multiple years. I hope this doesn't throw a wrench into it, and a wrench which has been made even more possible because of the crazy change to the rules we'll get to a bit later. And so it kind of goes back to our comment about Eli. Why now? I mean, Steve Smith's a guy in that position. They could have just waited and said, let's just queue up the wide receivers and get that settled. And it's not going to get any better because we have a bona fide first ballot wide receiver coming in a year from now, as well as
sorry.
a third
Just pausing
commentary.
this.
The commentator has joined
Yeah,
us.
yeah. So
Apparently, he has strong views about Steve Smith and receivers. He wants to whisper those in your ear.
yeah, yeah. I don't know what. Well, I mean, like when he's no, actually, you never saw any Steve Smith play. You were only 2 years old, but uh, sorry about that.
That's okay.
God, I love this dog. Saying that, I mean, like, I don't think Steve Smith's going to throw a monkey in this wrench at all. I really don't, because unlike, and I'm pretty high on Steve Smith. I don't have a problem with him being here, but I don't think he was that Andre Johnson type of player where you're thinking like, well, because both Andre and Steve didn't have the best players around them, but Andre felt like more of a superstar to me. So I think he comes in as the definitive three tier behind Wayne and Holt. I've been very open about my belief that Torrey Holt was actually better than Isaac Bruce. And I think when I brought that to the group, I haven't necessarily been disproven or even anyone saying, yeah, I agree with you or disagree with you. So for me, and it's weird because as a Saints guy, why should I have an attachment to Torrey Holt? But I do at this point. I really just want to get a wide receiver in. If it's Reggie Wayne, I'm not as big on Wayne personally as I am on Holt, but the best thing for the whole process, in my opinion, is to get one of those two in
Yeah.
because we know who's coming out. We got what Fitzgerald is. When is he next year?
Yeah. I mean, Larry Fitzgerald is only a
Okay.
year away, and he's going to walk right in first
As he
ballot.
should.
So along with Drew Brees. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's the situation we've got. But and I think you're probably right in terms of they've got Steve Smith. He's obviously has support. They're going to discuss him. I think his likelihood of getting to the next stage, which the final 10 vote down that first round voting in the selection meeting, is probably unlikely. He'll probably fall off at that point. They've got him here, but yeah, the logjam only gets worse if they don't resolve it. So I feel pretty good about Holt's case. I think the voters are well familiar with him. I think whoever's going to present him can make another strong case. And they know the queue. They know what they're facing with the wide receivers, the voters as a group. And I would actually it would probably be my biggest shock, surprise if he's not elected in this class, that being Holt.
Mhm. Well, we've got the offensive linemen. I think we've all been sort of like very big personally. Well, oh, sorry, I've skipped something. I've skipped Antonio Gates at tight end. Uh,
Well, we can make that real quick, folks. Listen, he should have got in first ballot a year ago. He has
okay,
all the
there we go. I
credentials.
agree.
He checks all the boxes right across the board. There's really the only, you know, voters are hard on certain positions. I don't really understand why sometimes, but there's a handful of positions they tend to be very selective about, and tight end is one of them. Although it's changing slowly as the game changes. We've talked about this at length as they become more and more important. We're going to get a wave of tight ends coming in and getting elected. But historically, the Hall has only elected 8 or 9 true full modern tight ends,
Mhm.
and for whatever reason, they decided last year that he could wait a year, and they moved others ahead and elected him. But I would rank him as the number one bona fide, and I don't think I'm going to be shocked at all. I think he is getting in the class. They're going to have a class of at least 3 moderns. He is going to be one of them. Um,
Mhm.
he has everything, the credentials, and he came so close last year, and a lot of controversy, debate, and angst when he was not elected, including by some of the voters, which makes me believe that he will get a harder push. And there is a path here for him, and I don't have any doubt that he's going to be in the class of 2025.
Yeah, I liked your point too about like the changing thing with tight ends. Uh, I mean, Brock Bowers just set the tight end receiving
Yeah.
record, breaking Mike Ditka on a team, the Raiders. That let's be blunt, how much of us, if you're not a Raiders fan and you're probably not paying that much attention to him right now, so he kind of
Yeah, there's a guy who, set a historic record that had
Mhm.
been in existence for decades, and nobody knows him. And you're right. Very few people have seen him play because the Raiders have not had a very good season. So it's
Mhm.
kind of like the buzz came late and then people picked up on it, but it's really sort of caught a lot of people by surprise, the kind of season he's had. But it's reflective of the fact that when you don't have receivers and you're trying to run an offense in today's league, if you have a talented threat at tight end, you're going to use them, and that's exactly what the Raiders did. Probably the only successful aspect of their play or their team entire season. And but yeah, largely under the radar. But it does kind of reflect the fact that the tight ends are getting obviously a lot more focus, and we're going to get several more of them elected. in the coming years. It may take a while, but guys like Jason Witten and
Mhm.
Gronkowski and Jason Kelsey eventually are just three, and there are probably some others that are going to creep up in this decade that we will see in the near future. But I think Gates would still be considered among many people top five, if not top 10 tight end of all time, which means, yeah, he's going to get in.
Mhm. Well, we got two not two, three, sorry, three offensive linemen who made it through. Returnee, the person who seems to be at the top of the queue, Willie Anderson, one of my guys, Jari Evans, and new guy, Marshall Yanda. Uh, I'm hoping that I'll be blunt. Willie Anderson, I've got one person in our group. I think is it Pierce or is it Brian? He's going right back into like watching all the Willie Anderson ones because again, no disrespect Bengals fans, but when Willie was playing, he wasn't necessarily national television material. So I think we have one individual who's going back and actually logging because I know there was a stat that came out that said that Willie Anderson had only allowed was it 16 or 19
Yeah,
sacks,
something like that. Yeah,
something like that,
which is a
which is
incredibly small number
just
over a
probably not
relatively long
true.
period. It's probably not, and it's created a lot of controversy in the
Hmm.
sense that that label, if you want to call it a label, maybe that's not the right term for it. But anyway, that fact has stuck to his resume and his case. It's one that people will use to advocate for him, including voters and whoever's going to present him. And yet, a lot of people are questioning the accuracy of that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we think of an era today, right, where every snap is recorded, watched, and analyzed, and we have pretty sophisticated data analytics being produced on every player in every game. But that was not the case. The film existed. We all know he played when all the games were on film, but we played in an era when that kind of level of data analytics was not in place. So it's great that people are going back and trying to look at some of that film. And let's say if the number's right or if it's small, let's at least get it correct. Let's let the facts speak for themselves here and not
We like Willie. We just
misconstrue
want to
it.
point that out. I mean, like I'm not
Yeah,
anti,
yeah.
yeah, but it's one of those things that I could be wrong on this because I think you've been more active on social media longer than I have. I could be mistaken, but I believe once that came out, he was a finalist or a semifinalist right away. Am I correct on that?
You're
That's how it feels in my
it's
head.
right in that timeline, close
Yeah.
enough that yes. I mean, clearly it was a factor, and it was a factor that, in interviews and his presenter was able to compile and make use of that and move that and advocate it with the other voters and then get enough voters to support him to get to a finalist and then having him presented and discussed. Yeah, things like that can often, a new angle, a new perspective on a candidate can suddenly elevate them in the process very quickly. And that has certainly happened to Willie Anderson. And again, I don't think either one of us are really here to say he doesn't deserve to be in. It's just that let's make sure his case is accurate and truthful
Right.
because you're only going to elect between three and five of these modern players out of these 15. They all deserve to be presented and have a true, accurate assessment of their resume as being presented.
So with that, we have a Jari Evans who obviously is a Saints guy. I'm pretty big on him. I certainly watched enough of what he did to be here. I am a little like surprised that he got as far as he did this quick. I don't know that and it's weird for me to say that I have a slight problem with it only because of the two people who are not here. Marshall Yanda, I've got actually higher than those two personally. Uh, but we talk about sort of those who got left behind. We've got two major names in the twilight of their eligibility, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that. Richmond Webb and Steve Wisniewski, two guys who were in my top 50 overall of not in the hall, uh, both sort of in a weird way the victim of playing for high profile teams at the wrong time. They're sort of that generation's Logan Mankins.
Yeah.
another person who could easily be here.
Yeah. Well, and
Go
if we
ahead.
break it down, I mean, they're all three of them are offensive linemen, but unfortunately, not all offensive lineman positions are viewed the same. We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But if we look at the tight end, I mean, sorry, if we look at the tackle situation, we talked about Willie Anderson, but left behind is Richard Webb, and he only has one more year as a modern finalist. It gets very hard if you don't get in this queue to the 15 within a few years. Albert Lewis a few years ago, there was a big late push, right, to get him in moving
Yeah.
in the process. But it was his last year as a modern. They actually got him all the way to the final 15. He made the final 10, but was not elected and fell into the senior pool. A lot of us would argue, well, that was great, but the push for Albert Lewis should have happened 2 or 3 years before and not his last year, which is what Richard Webb is facing. And going back to this too many first ballot being pushed in, and also are sort of wondering whether someone like Steve Smith or Fred Taylor and a couple of the guys we're going to talk about should needed to be moved into this group. They're taking a slot, and in my view, one of those guys probably took a slot from Richard Webb. We don't need three wide receivers, but another offensive lineman is deserving, especially one who's running out of his time on the ballot. And then you mentioned Steve Winooski. There's
Yeah.
a guy who checks all the boxes. I mean, multiple All-Pro, a ton of Pro Bowls. His
Nine.
career, he was viewed as being a bit of a nasty, dirty player, but he wasn't the only one. But he's running out of time very quickly. And, we talked about tight ends, right? Not really getting a lot of love from voters. Offensive guard, um, haven't got much at all. It took Alan Faneca, who I think is better
Oh,
than the guards on here. It took him 6 years to get elected. And that guy was the
he could
first
have been
team
a
All
first ballot
Pro.
Hall of Famer.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
was on that. I was on that train. I think before you and I were ever first talking. But yeah, because
And I was shocked that it took him that long because he had all the credentials. But what it was partially because, as an offensive guard, he
he
just
got
wasn't
lapped
getting.
by two other
Yeah,
guards because Hutchinson went ahead of
yeah,
him. Who was the other
yeah,
one? Kevin Malway. Again,
yeah.
two incredible players who I thought sort of jumped him. And again, in my opinion,
So, but for me, when it comes to the two for Evans and Yada, I'm actually very pleased that they gotten this far as fast as they have. Evans, I think it's just his, he's just been on the ballot a couple of years, and Yada's the first ballot. I think it's great of offensive guards. They're probably going to sit here for a while. I don't think until Zach Martin appears on the ballot, which is still several years away, I don't think there's anybody coming in the queue that's going to surpass either one of them at that position. It's pretty. The voters are going to be split between the two of them. That's going to take the voters a while to sort out. But I'd rather see them here in the 15 and have guards represented than have them floating in the semifinalists year after year after year. I don't think either one of them really have a decent shot this year, but they're well positioned. It may take them 3 or 4 years, maybe longer. That's kind of unfortunate, but they're here and they came in early, and we know that's a good sign.
well, so we'll go to the defensive side of the ball. We only have one defensive lineman. Uh, Jared Allen's in this interesting spot because he was a finalist on year one. He's now a finalist also in year five. So one, two, three, four, five. Allen, I'm hesitant to call him a one trick pony, but that one trick of just being an outstanding pass rusher, well, it's gotten people in the hall before pretty quickly. Allen was super popular. He check you said the term checks a lot of the boxes. A phenomenal player. And part of me just wants me to say, get him in now
Yeah.
just to avoid an eventual clog. I think because he's sort of alone right now, this should help him. I mean, my gut says this is his year that he finally gets in. What do you think?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I always refer to, does a guy have a path? And that's just kind of what you're referring to. Does he have a path to get elected? And Allen does, right? Because voters love the pass rushers, whether they play the high red or whether they're playing defensive end or outside linebacker. And they voted in a whole bunch of them over the last several years. And some of them have um, understandably leapfrogged Jared Allen. But there is nobody now, and I don't think there's anybody immediately coming up. Suggs, we're going to talk about, he's a bit different of a background of a player. But at any rate, for Jared Allen, I think you're right. And he made the final 10 last year and maybe the year before, if I can remember correctly. So again, the voters, there, he has enough support. They're going to let guys, and he has no other real direct competition. He's been here. They've talked about him. I haven't really heard any negative kind of perceptions of his resume, and I think he's just had to wait for the pass rusher queue to kind of play out the last 4 or 5 years. And I think he's certainly gonna. I would put him behind Gates, frankly, as you know, if I was ranking all of these in terms of probability of election.
Mhm.
Um, I would put him second. I think that's how well positioned he is and
Okay.
well deserved.
I got so we'll go with the linebackers because you were sort of like talking there. The person who I've got as my most wanted, and I'll admit there's a bit of a bias, only because I saw him play a lot. You being a Cowboys fan, I mean, when you're watching, I guess Washington, New York, Philly, you see them a lot. That's how I feel about Carolina as a
Right.
Saints guy. Luke Kuechly was the one person on the defensive side of the ball I could not stop watching because I knew wherever he was, I didn't want to be. We talked about quarterbacks. This is the definition of a defensive quarterback. I'm I don't know if you and I are going to be there next year. I hope we are. But there'll be the one person that me as a Saints guy will be standing up high, like you earned it. And I think Kuechly is got the best shot, or should have the best shot, as the one and in, first and in. Am I wrong?
Well, he
Could
has
be.
so I'm not going to question his resume because
Yeah.
it's fantastic. Um, but there are two things that give me a little bit of a pause. Three things actually. One
Okay.
is relatively shorter career, right?
Hmm.
And again, our viewers know, and the
Patrick Willis
Hall
vibes.
voter. Sorry.
Patrick Willis vibes.
Well, yeah, that's second point. So the
Yeah.
first one is, yeah, shorter careers are tough. Yes, voters are electing in more guys with shorter careers, but not necessarily first ballot. So that makes me pause. The second one is, yes, this argument and debate, and it's an interesting one. Is he better? Is his resume in his case that much stronger than Patrick Willis, who waited a few years and finally got elected? I think one of the biggest distinctions between the two, right, is Luke has a Defensive Player of the Year award, but otherwise their careers in terms of accomplishments are
Luke's was a
very
little longer,
similar.
a little longer, but yeah,
A little longer,
similar.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so that makes me pause. And the third thing, other thing that makes me pause is this whole math situation. We're talking about it later when we wrap things up, perhaps about how this is going to work in the coming weeks.
Very
But
important.
there's a chance we don't see five. We've seen five modern pretty consistent for many, many years elected. The math and how they're doing things this year might suggest we might end up with four. And I just wonder whether because of just because that very mi and my reservations are all very minor. I suspect the voters are aware of them, and for them it's probably minor. But I worry is he the guy who might just not quite get the 80%? And we'll have to see.
Hmm.
I've heard voters speak very highly of him and his resume. So I guess it's going to be very, very close. Would it surprise? Let me put it this way: it wouldn't really surprise me either way if he was in or not in.
And so in the same position, we've got Terrell Suggs, who is, I feel so weird about this. I have him as right now close to a top. Do I have him top 10? I think I have him top 10 of those who are not in. Another first ballot induct, like a possibility. This is a bad ballot for him only because I think, and I don't know if the voters agree with me or not, they might have him slightly behind Keekly. I,
No,
yeah.
I think you're right. And if I can go back to an analogy I used earlier, does he have a path to be elected this year? I don't think he does. And again, it's not a credentials thing. Kind of surprised. I mean, it doesn't surprise me he's first ballot. There's five first ballot guys here, as we mentioned before. It would not have surprised me if he didn't quite make the final 15 this year as first ballot. We've elected a lot of that kind of position. He has a well-rounded career. He certainly deserves it. I just don't think he's going to be at the top of the minds of the voters this year. But he's here as a first ballot. And like our good friend Jack doing his research has pointed out, you make it to the final 15 as your first year, you're getting in 1 year sooner or later, and he certainly will.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to the secondary. We got two guys who one you know very well. Uh, we got Eric Allen and Darren Woodson. Both of them have, let's see, well, their time is running out for in both cases. Uh, Allen and Woodson, like both of them are in a weird way, it's sort of good for them that they're against each other because any, we don't have a Troy Polamalu here. We don't have
Right.
names that are that much better. I mean, actually, I've got Earl Thomas ahead of both of them. But Earl Thomas, if you want to go to what we want to talk about character, which I don't really want to be honest. Uh,
And we're not, and voters aren't supposed to, but yeah,
and some don't, and some do.
yeah.
Yeah, we certainly know that. I had a great conversation with our good friend Ken Crippen, who said that when he thinks about it, and he was on one of the committees for contributor, he says he doesn't consider it, or that he would not, and he would not for anything else. And but that doesn't mean that what he thinks is the blanket.
Yeah.
Allen and Woodson, both are two people. Both I like. Both I don't think have a shot in hell. Am I wrong?
Well, it's getting tight, right? If we think, if we, especially if we think there's going to be less than five, we're getting to where it's being a little tight here in terms of who else might have a shot.
Yeah.
I would say, they're both deserving to have the resume. I think the one advantage that Allen would hold is what you pointed out. I think, he has one more year as a modern finalist. This is his second year making the final 15. Last year he didn't advance to the final 10, but obviously voters are aware of his case and they're aware that his time is running out. So that might be enough incentive to save him. It because he's had more time in front of this group than Albert Lewis got. Just talked about that earlier. It all
Yeah.
happened in 1 year for him and it didn't work. So I think that's to his advantage. Um, in the case of Darren Woodson, I believe he has 3 more years actually left as a modern after this year, so he has some time. The distinction I would make is last year Woodson made it to the final 10 and Allen did not. So Allen has this one advantage of he's running out of time and they should maybe be thinking about advancing him quickly, whereas Woodson in their queue is ahead of Allen. But your point is well taken. I think both of them aren't going to get in. If we group them as one, I think that the collective two of them are on the bubble, which could burst either way.
Okay. All right. So I guess you think they have a better shot than I do.
But
And
it's going to be tough.
yeah, so we've got one player left, and then afterwards, I'd like you to go through the rules because again, we've noticed that some of the voters might not even understand exactly how this is going to work.
Yeah,
But
seems to be a problem.
yes, absolutely. So we've got one special teams player, someone who I think I don't know if he's the greatest place kicker of all time, but he has the best career of any place kicker of all time. I've got Justin Tucker ahead of him in his prime, but it's not about your prime. It's about where you are in the situation that it is. Uh, especially when you and I look at kickers,
Yeah.
right? As we looked at that from the 70s to the 80s and moving forward and how that all goes. Sorry, our co-host has decided to be a little bit of a pain in the butt, so she's going to join us here. Winnie, say hello. All right. Adam Vinatieri. has the greatest career of any place kicker, period. Uh, End stop, full stop, however the kids want to say it. It's not even close. He's got all the records. He has possibly one of the most amazing kicks. If Tom Brady's arm created the dynasty, if Bill Belichick's mind created the dynasty, it all began off of Adam Vinatieri's leg in the snow. He's got everything you need. I don't think that there's one person who doesn't think that he's a Hall of Famer. Do they put him on first ballot? And I don't know this off the top of my head. We don't have a whole lot of pure kickers. So we have, when did Stenerud get in? What year?
So Stenerud went in at first ballot,
Okay,
but Morton Anderson did not. And those are two of the more famous,
right.
I guess, place characters we want to talk about because they both, yeah, at one point were at the top of, the list of total points. They were the guys that were well known. We're talking, if not one, multiple all-decade teams selections. This is the kind of the company we're talking about here. If we want to toss the names of Adam Vinatieri, Jan Stenerud, and Morton Anderson. And if you're going to have that debate about the best kicker of all time, I think, Jason Tucker, although the shine has come off a little bit this season, but if you, Adam's in that discussion. I mean, if you're not the guy, you're in the discussion for the guy, and that's pretty impressive when you think about 100 plus years of the NFL. And so, yeah, if he looks to Jan Stenerud in that case, and you're like, okay, it's not unforeseen, right, that a guy like Adam Vinatieri, the most popular, well-known kicker of his era for 20 years, all the voters know him. They all saw him play. They all saw those gig six, so they all know him. So there's no going to be no unknowns there. Or is it the Morton Anderson situation where, oh, he's a great kicker, one of the greatest of all time, but he's a kicker. So we're not going to put him in
Mhm.
first ballot because we don't do
But
that with
Morton
special
didn't
team
have
players.
that iconic moment.
Oh
Morton
yeah.
doesn't have the rings. Morton didn't go to a second team and
Oh
then
yeah.
still dominate. I mean, like Adam Vinatieri for me, if and this like if I was a voter, this is where it would be tricky for me. Is Adam Vinatieri one of the top five people here? No. Is Adam Vinatieri the best that ever did what he did? Yes. So where do I elevate him and
Yeah.
who do I not put him over?
Yeah,
And
that's an interesting way to look at it,
yeah,
Kurt, because in these 15 finalists here, right, there is nobody else in this group, I'm pretty confident I can say this, that would be considered top two or three all time at their position, except for Adam Vinatieri. So that carries a lot of weight.
was he not also part of, he's also the only person here who's part of the 100th anniversary team.
Yep.
So, I mean,
So I think he's got a really good shot. Um, it's just that, our good friend, I met him briefly, but the greatest kick returner, punt returner of all time, Devin Hester, had to wait a couple years and just got
you're a good
elected.
friend. I never met him at all. So
Yeah, I met him briefly in the hall there last August after the ceremony a couple days later. But
I must
so
have been,
they made him wait, and he was on that 100th anniversary team. They made him wait a couple years.
yeah.
If my gut tells me that he doesn't get elected, but it would not surprise me at all if he gets in. But I also wonder whether, again, not to hammer the point because we're going to go over in a minute, but if they're not going to elect five, is he the guy that doesn't get in because he gets just short of the 80% and he's not among those five? Um, I think of all of these 15, it's maybe an odd thing to say. I think the outcome with his case is going to be the most interesting to me because it could go
No,
either way.
no, I agree with you totally.
It could go either way, and I can understand why it would. I think it's just going to be fascinating to see
Him and Eli.
how that plays out.
Yeah, I'm the most fascinated about those two completely. I can't wait to see it. But I think we want to close, and I'm sort of glad you sort of like worked the way in our previous discussion because that's how I wanted this to go. Actually, you'd think that we planned this, but we didn't. There's a lot of people who are not certain how the votes are going to work this year, or they're not aware that it's changed, which I think is more accurate. And I'd like you to sort of like go through like how the process will change for a lot of people in the fact that we may not see a large class out of this group. So I cede to you, sir.
Right. So in terms of the moderns, the process of the countdown to 25 to 15, that's been in place for decades. And the end result historically has been a process which you get to final five, and then those five are each at the final stage, they get one final vote, yes or no. And as long as they get 80%, they're in. And unlike maybe back in the 70s and 80s and even in the early 2000s, we would see fewer than five. But for the last 15, 16, 17 years, we kind of accepting the fact that five moderns get in.
Mhm.
Well, the rules have changed. I think because the hall wants to create a little more uncertainty, a little more challenge to, and not just sort of rubber stamp, well, whoever the final five are, they're in. So this year, instead of going from 10, from 15 to 10, they will do that in the meeting. But not going from 10 to 5, but they're going to go from 10 to 7. And at that final stage, the 50 voters are each going to give a ballot with those seven names, and they can choose five. And if you do the math with 50 voters and each one of them having five slots, that's 250 total votes. Jack Silverson, our good friend, his mothers have gotten out the pencil and the envelope or sorry, the napkin and done the math. If you work on that, you begin to see or realize, some of these guys could easily clear 50, but will take total votes away from that 250. And there could be split voting where one guy gets, say, 36 and somebody else gets 32, and neither one of them do get the 40, which they need, 40 being roughly the 80% barrier. If we assume all 50 are there, the voters. We and the hall, when they made these changes in their press announcement in the summer, indicated, yeah, they said there's a possibility that we will see classes smaller than the maximum, which this year is still eight. But we have, five senior and coach and contributor finalists fighting for three slots, and they need 80%. We may get three of them. We may only get one or two of them in out of those five. And out of these 15, we're not guaranteed that we're going to get five. It
Right.
might
Because
mean
they're
that somebody
competing, because
falls
the
short.
seven that go through, they're competing with the seniors too.
Yeah.
Well, no, well, no,
No, they're not competing. They're separate.
yeah, they have a
They're sorting those
separate
five out. Their five
five.
will be presented.
Yeah.
So they're going to get a maximum of three, but and there has to be a minimum of three total. So it's likely three moderns are going to be safe. I think on this ballot we can find three people that would get the minimum 40 votes out of 50 or the 80%. The question is, does a fourth or a fifth make it? And it's all new to everyone following this process. Not everybody's thought this through. I think there are going to be a lot of people surprised if we end up with a class of
Including
four
the
moderns.
voters.
And I think there's going to be voters when they go in that room, and it's a virtual meeting, but in mid-January, and this is discussed, they're going to be a little bit surprised. I think some of them are assuming, hey, we're figure this out and we'll come up with five guys and they're all going to get in as moderns. They can't, rules don't allow them to discuss or combine votes or negotiate or
Wow.
horse trade votes. All that kind of stuff can't be done in the meeting. I think a few of them are going to be shocked during the meeting and after the meeting if we don't elect four. If four are not, sorry, if five are not elected. I think a lot of people are going to be shocked. The hall knows what it's doing here. It wants smaller classes. I think the class of 2023, which had nine people to it, all deserving, really caused a flood of complaints from other people in the media, some voters, some predominant Hall of Famers to say that's just watering down the hall. It's too many. It's not selective. You need more rigor. Last year, the class was smaller because they didn't elect the coach and they didn't elect one of the seniors. And the hall this year has decided to, surprisingly, many of the voters weren't aware of these changes were coming until they were announced. And they would prefer to see a class of 6 or 7 rather than a maximum, in this case, of 8. And we very well might see a class of 6 or 7, and not all three
Yeah.
slots of the senior coach contributor filled, and not all 5 moderns. We don't know. We don't know how the process and the voters are going to respond to this, but we have to be prepared for an outcome that's going to look a lot different, is going to surprise a lot of people. It's possible.
And I'll say this: the Pro Football Hall of Fame in the last 10 years, they're trying to be more fluid. They're trying to be more reactive. That's a good thing. Where they're trying to like play around with rules, see what sort of like what sticks. If this goes too short, where there's only like 3 people, and then 3 next year, they'll course correct. I'd like to think that they will. I could be
No,
wrong
I
on that,
I think you're
but
right. I mean,
yeah.
it's like a pendulum, right?
Yeah.
For our viewers, there were a lot of small classes even in the early 2000s, classes of 4, 5.
Oh
The
God,
rules
yeah,
have
yeah.
changed. The rules have changed, particularly in terms of seniors, coaches, and contributors. But we have seen a trend towards larger classes of 7, 8, 9 in the last several years. So the pendulum towards a larger hall to get a lot of folks in, players who were deserving, many in who had waited a long time as moderns and or seniors. That's how the view went. And when Porter became president of the hall, he was in view. And a lot of voters said we needed to get more seniors in. So they were putting in 3 a year they were going to do it for 3 years. It only turned out to be 2 years. And one year they put 3 in, and one year they didn't, only put 2. So now you're right. It's quickly switched to a rule, a setup that's going to have a smaller class. And I think you're right. They're just trying to find the middle point here. And my guess is that this will be fine-tuned after a year or two if they get a lot of criticism coming back saying, well, we would like smaller classes, but you're leaving out deserving players. Well, people, you can't have both. You can't have a class of 6
Mhm.
and not leave out deserving players. If you want deserving players or candidates, coaches, and contributors, maybe 6 isn't the number. Maybe it's not 9. Maybe it's 7 or 8 or somewhere in there. And I suspect that you're right that the pendulum needs to come back to the middle somewhere on this in terms of the total class size. And we're going to get there in a few years because I think there's going to be voters and others who are going to be like, there are guys who are falling off the modern ballot who aren't getting a shot, and there are guys sitting on the modern ballot too long, and there's seniors who are still deserving and not getting elected if we're only going to have a class of, say, 6. And I think we're going to see, but for the time being, with the class of 2025, I think we should all prepare ourselves, and none of us should be shocked, although we may be annoyed and aggravated by the outcome, to see a class of perhaps 6 or 7.
No, I think you're right. I guess with that, Paul, thanks so much for making yourself available for that. If
No
you like what
problem.
you
And we won't have
hear,
to wait much longer. The voters are going to meet mid-January, virtual, so they will make their final decisions in this process for both this group of the modern and, was mentioned, the group that represents the finalists from the senior coaches and contributors. And then on the NFL Honors Show, which is the Thursday night before the Super Bowl, this year it's on February 6th.
Mhm.
The class of 2025, whether it's 6, 7 people or 8 or whatever, and who they may come out of this group, we
Which will
will
be leaked
finally know.
the days before.
It's only about just over 5 weeks away, so we're at that final steps, literally. And
Oh, wow.
we won't know much or hear more anything because nothing else gets really discussed publicly. They kind of go behind the closed doors, behind the curtain, and they do their work, and we'll find out on February 6th who of these 15 plus of the other group we mentioned, the senior contributor and contributors, coaches, make up the hall of the class of 2025 for the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
All right. Well, if you like everything that we do here, thank you so much. Check out some of the other shows that Paul and I do, where we look at old football games. We've got a few that are coming out soon. Uh, I'm looking forward to. I think in 2025 we're gonna up our guest star game.
That's great because we've had them on a few of our Super Bowl and historic game coverages, and the guests are always great. Many of them saw the game as it happened, or they know the history of their franchise. And there's a lot of great personal stories and anecdotes that add to kind of the play-by-play and the breakdown that you and I do. We try to point out the careers and the Hall of Famers in these games and the historical context of the game. It's nice to have a personal insight from our guests.
Yeah, it's a lot better than this guest star.
Well, he makes a quite a good visual appearance. He looks great on camera.
Only to say touchdown. Okay. Well, this makes me look like I'm really abusing you there. Uh, but that's Winnie the Jet. My little mini dash into. I'd like to think loves me, but who knows?
Who
Uh,
knows?
who knows? Check out everything else that we do here at NotInHallOfFame.com. We are also going to be doing a show that Jack Silverstein is going to be hosting in the next couple of days. I know that you're going to be a part of that, where we're doing our mock class for 2025. It's a little different because we sort of started this. It's like a parallel universe, so like discussing like the MCU, right? The Marvel universe. Well, this is our multiverse where we've already inducted some people who are not in. So I'm really excited about that. Jack always does a wonderful job as the host. Thank God I don't have to do it. It's kind of nice when I'm not doing all the talking. I think it's really nice. I think my wife likes it when I'm not doing all the talking. All
I know the feeling.
right, well, there you go. But with that, check out everything we do wherever you are, wherever you may be. Make this a great day because it never comes again. Take care, everybody.